nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika tat-pada-laṅghanam yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jadamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Kathamaham Payurasho Murakedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yasha Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarva Swaparambo Jo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoyir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdamta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Atupada-padme Bhakterya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajuyugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva tasyai namah Yaram yanikilagha sangha shamani shrotratritim sangata Ya swadhyai rasikai sukabdi janani dhikkarya mukti spriham Ya dhyata hridaye vrajendra tanuja premamrita syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the Kris Jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we will resume our discussion of Padyavali. And today we commence the prakaran on disregard for moksha. So we concluded the prakaran about longing, or utkanta, in the previous class, and then we introduced this prakaran, how the commentator considered that the author may have, or the compiler may have been concerned that readers would interpret the longing that he described as being only a longing for a means to moksha, rather than as being longing for one's actual ultimate object, or purushartha, namely that bhakti itself, or prema for Bhagavān, is itself the purushartha, and bhaktas long for that as well as for expressions of that, the outcomes of that, such as the darshan of Bhagavān, the service of Bhagavān, and so forth, as their ultimate aim in and of itself. So, with that, we come to verse 110, starting this prakaran, Atha Mokṣa Anādār. Now, disregard for moksha. Bhakti sevā bhagavato muktis tat-pada-laṅghanam dāsatāṁ prāpya prābhavaṁ padam icchati. Bhakti is service to Bhagavān. Mukti is disregard for that object. What fool, having attained that servitude to Bhagavān, desires the position of mastership? So bhakti is service to Bhagavān, mukti is disregard for service to Bhagavān. What fool, having attained service to Bhagavān, desires the position of mastership, or of being a recipient of service rather than an offerer of service. So the rhetorical implied sense being many. In other words, it's foolish to desire that. So why would one desire that and thus be foolish? The implication being, bhakti itself is the worthy object to be desired and not moksha. So we'll look a little bit at what is referred to by moksha here, as well as some broader Gaudiya Siddhanta regarding this subject matter. So, the commentary. The bhakti spoken of in this verse is the causeless bhakti that was discussed in the commentary on verse 94 here in Padyavali. That is the fourth verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So when he's talking about bhakti here, he's not just talking about bhakti of any type, he's meaning pure bhakti, uttam bhakti, ahaituki bhakti. This is to say that the bhakti spoken of in the verse under discussion is the pure or uttama bhakti defined by the compiler at the outset of his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as, quote, continuous action for Krishna possessed of anukulya, favorability, meaning effort pleasing to Sri Krishna, the recipient thereof, that is free from desirousness of anything else and unobstructed by jnana, karma, and so forth. Sri Jiva also discusses a verse from Garuda Purana in his Bhakti Sandarbha that clarifies why the term bhakti is to be equated with service to Sri Bhagavān. So, Jiva Gosvami, when he's defining bhakti in the Bhakti Sandarbha, this is the verse that he uses. Bhaja iti esha vai dhatu sevāyam parikirtitaha tasmat seva buddhai prokta bhakti sadhana bhuyasi. The verbal root bhaj, that is, the root from which the word bhakti is made, is spoken or employed in the sense of service, sevā, in the case of the word bhakti. Therefore, the great sadhana known as bhakti is said to be service by the wise. So, roots in Sanskrit from which nouns, verbs, etc. are made can have multiple different meanings, or they can be used to describe different types of actions, just as in English sometimes or other languages, the same phenomenon is also found. So, one of the meanings that the root bhaj can convey is that of service. It's not the only meaning, it's one of the meanings that it can convey. So, this verse is spoken in this context to indicate that when the word bhakti is used, the primary sense of the root dhatu from which the word bhakti is derived is in the sense of service or sevā. And thus, the wise, when they speak of bhakti, if they were to explain what is bhakti, they just say it is sevā. So you can sometimes see, I've seen some academic writing where Western scholars will analyze the Vaishnava traditions or the broader Hindu bhakti traditions, and they'll portray the idea of bhakti as participation. And they'll show that the root bhaj can also mean to share or to be a holder in something, which is true etymologically. The word bhaj can convey that sense. So then if you apply that sense and then you try to read out the significance of the word bhakti or narrations about bhakti with reference to that meaning, then you'll get a different impression of the texts. So it's noteworthy that in texts like the Purana, some statements in the Puranas themselves, such as this in the Garuda Puran, are clarifying in which sense certain words are intended to be used. And moreover, acaryas, thus is their job, so to speak, is to draw out the tat-pada, or the intent of a text, by analyzing what is this range, the semantic range of a particular root or a particular word, and which meaning within that range is applicable in the context of its usage, or is likely that was conceived in the mind of the author. So here, when it says bhakti is service to Bhagavān, this is giving background why this statement is made. So when the bhakti spoken of in the verse under discussion is in this way considered uttama bhakti, then the mukti spoken of in this verse can be considered any of the 5 types of mukti, since a follower of the path of uttama bhakti does not desire any of these types of bhakti. So, with all due respect, here I'm disagreeing with the commentator on the text here. He interprets the word mukti here to refer specifically to sayujya mukti, which is perhaps the more likely or common understanding, and certainly is not in any way inapt. But if we read the statement in light of other teachings that Rupa Gosvami himself and Jiva Gosvami have given in their writings, then we can say that it's not only sayujya mukti, it can refer to mukti and in all of its categorical forms. So this is a subtlety of the Goswami Siddhānta that I'm drawing out from the Sandarbhas and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu in this case, and then I do note what the commentator has to say a little bit later on. But I just in case it sounds slightly unconventional or someone's wondering why, then that's how this point is coming out here. So when the bhakti spoken of in the verse under discussion is in this way considered pure or uttama bhakti, then the mukti spoken of in the verse can be considered any of the 5 types of mukti, since a follower of the path of uttama bhakti does not desire any of these types of mukti, as was discussed earlier in the commentary on verse 83 here in Padyavali, with reference to the compiler's analysis in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1-56-57, that one-pointed bhaktas who, quote, cherish only the sweetness of prema, who are premaika madhurya jusha, never accept sukh aishvaryottara mukti, that is, any form of mukti in which pleasure and powerfulness are overlaid, that is, are the object of desire predominantly, or even prema sevottara mukti, that is, mukti in which service with prema is overlaid, that is the object of desire predominantly. And as we discussed before, when you read this, you might think, mukti in which desire for service with prema is predominant, what's wrong with that? Then, because they are desires only of the satisfaction of Sri Bhagavān and the sweetness of prema, and thus not even of a form of moksha in which there is even partial secondary desire for an object other than service with prema, so as to satisfy Sri Bhagavān, be it mukti or any other object. Maybe that makes it a little more clear. So this is something we already discussed in the commentary in verse 83. Rupa Goswami makes three categories. Persons who desire the pleasure and the power of being a mukta, of varieties of moksha, and along with that, they're glad for some bhakti too. Then there are people who desire predominantly service out of love for Bhagavān, but still they're also glad to get mukti in some form or another. And then the third category is what he calls here the premaika madhurya jusha, or those who desire the sweetness of prema alone and don't care about moksha, don't desire even a form of moksha, they just desire prema and only prema. So Rupa Goswami obviously champions this third category, and as we discussed previously, cites some 25 verses to emphasize the point that bhaktas do not consider prema bhakti their ultimate purushartha. More generally speaking, so the implication here is that in the verse under discussion, it's saying mukti is disregard for that object, meaning bhakti is service to Bhagavān, so mukti is disregard for that service. So the idea here means that mukti in and of itself is not necessarily antithetical to service to Bhagavān. So what really is meant is that mukti is, quote, disregard for that object, meaning desire for mukti is disregard for that object. Because if you desire mukti, you're not one-pointedly desiring bhakti. So this is how it can be read. More generally speaking, the form of mukti spoken of by the author of the verse under discussion, who was a predecessor of Sri Rupa Pad, and the articulation of the aforementioned analysis of a uttam bhakta's desires, is likely simply sayuja mukti, because although desiring any form of mukti is antithetical to uttama bhakti in Sri Rupa Pad's view, as was discussed earlier in the commentaries on verses 83 and 94, there is no inherent contradiction or detriment to bhakti as a result of the acceptance of the other four forms of mukti, when they are attained by bhaktas as an unsought, secondary, and concomitant effect of their absorption in uttama bhakti. Moreover, innumerable bhaktas endowed with such forms of mukti eternally engage in uttama bhakti to Bhagavān in his various spiritual abodes. So if you say any form of mukti is disregard for the service of Bhagavān, then more or less you create the problem of saying, well then how does anyone even exist in the world of moksha, in the world of Vaikuntha, in the world of Goloka? If these two things were actually inherently antithetical, that whole world couldn't even exist. So the intent of the author can't be that moksha in and of itself is disregard for the feet of Bhagavān or for disregard for service to Bhagavān. What he means then is that it's desire for moksha rather than desire for bhakti, which is a form of disregard for bhakti. So Sri Rupa Pad also mentions this in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, after presenting 28 verses elucidating how and why Uttama Bhaktas have no desire for moksha, and just prior to his aforecited discussion of one-pointed bhaktas who cherish only the sweetness of prema. When shall we become such? Premaika madhurya jusha. So he says, quote, Atra tyajata tyayai vokta mukti panchavidapi chet salukyadis tatapyatra bhaktya nati virudhyate. Even though fivefold mukti has been described here as being fit to be rejected, still salokya and so forth, that is the four forms of mukti other than sayuja, are, quote, not excessively contradictory to bhakti. Okay, so he's saying they're not excessively contradictory. So that implies they're somewhat contradictory, or they're not exactly bhakti, they're something else, but they're not excessively that. Sri Chakravarti Pad comments, even though fivefold mukti has been described here as being fit to be rejected, still salokya and so forth, that is sarshti, samipya, and sarupya, though not sayujya, are not excessively contradictory to bhakti and not absolutely contradictory to it either, on account of hearing of bhakti in those cases. That is because it is heard in the Shastras that one can continue to engage in bhakti even after attaining those forms of mukti. So if they were absolutely contradictory or excessively contradictory, then you wouldn't hear of Bhaktas having them. But if we hear that Bhaktas have them, then we understand that they're not in and of themselves a problem, or they're not excessively untoward. Thus, the first four types of mukti, thus unlike the first four types of mukti, Sayuja Mukti, which is of two subdivisions, Brahma Sayuja Mukti, absorption in non-differentiated Brahman, and Bhagavat Sayuja Mukti, absorption in Bhagavān, that is differentiated Brahman, amounts to disregard for bhakti, because one who accepts the eternal state of Sayuja Mukti, so also by doing so, eternally forsakes any and all faculties and opportunity to ever engage in any form of bhakti to Bhagavān. That is, one effectively thereby rejects bhakti eternally. Sri Jiva describes all five of these forms of mukti and specific features of Sayuja Mukti as follows. So here we get some fine analysis about these different categories of mukti, which we had in the Priti Sandarbha. So we haven't covered those yet in this discussion of Padyavali, so we'll have them here. This is a long passage. He says, Muktischa panchadha. Mukti, furthermore, is fivefold. Salokya sarshti samipya sarupya sayuja bhedhena, in accord with the divisions of Salokya, Sarshti, Sarupya, Samipya, and Sayujya. Tatra, Salokyam, Samana Lokatvam, Sri Vaikunta Vasaha. Therein, Salokya means being on the same plane as Bhagavān, that is, residence in Sri Vaikunta. So Salokya means on the same loka, on the same plane. Sarshtis tatraiva samanaishvaryam api bhavatiti. Sarshti means specifically there, that is in Vaikunta, equal capability, or aishvarya, with that of Bhagavān, also comes about to some extent. So the second type of mukti means you're on the same plane as Bhagavān in Salokya, and in Sarshti you acquire aishvarya, so power or capability, however you want to consider it, that is equal with Bhagavān. So literally it just says that's equal with Bhagavān. Now that doesn't imply it's completely equal. It means it's somewhat equal. There's some amount of equality, so it's equal. Sarupyam tatraiva samana rupatadi prāpya te iti. Sarupya means specifically there in Vaikunta, attaining the same figure and so forth as Bhagavān. So it means you can have a body that looks just like Bhagavān, you can have the same figure, the same features, same garments, etc. So you can be in the same place, you can have a body just like his, and you can have power that's like his, not completely, but largely, or somewhat. Samipya samipa gaman adhikaratvam. Samipya means having the privilege of going near Bhagavān, there in Vaikuntha. And you can spend time with him, you can join his assemblies, you can participate in the social gatherings there in the Nishreyasa forest and in the palace and so forth. And finally, Sayujam Kesham Chit Bhagavat Shri Vigraha Eva Pravesho Bhavatiti. Sayuja means for some, that is for those who attain Bhagavat Sayuja rather than Brahma Sayuja, entrance into the divine body of Bhagavān itself. So Sayuja, alternately, means entering inside Bhagavān's body. So you can either have a body that's just like Bhagavān's, and in that sense also, quote, be inside Bhagavān's body in the sense that you're in a body that's like his, but in Sayuja, you will actually merge into his body. Now, in what sense is meant by merging, that will be clarified ahead. So, Salukyadivat sva abhimanatva bhavat spashto daharanam Srimata Bhagavatvena nakritam iti. A clear example of Sayuja is not given by Srimad Bhagavatam because of the non-existence of Sayujas being approved by it, that is, by the Bhagavatam, like Salokya and so forth. That is, as the other four forms of Mukti are, since only in these four other forms of Mukti and not in Sayuja is serving Bhagavān possible. Now someone might object here and say, but we hear about Agasura entering the body of Bhagavān, or we hear about other Asuras at the time of their leaving their body being perceived to merge into the body of Bhagavān. So, yet Jiva Goswami is saying there's no example given in the Bhagavatam of Sayuja. Doesn't Jiva Goswami, isn't he well aware of these examples? So he definitely is, and that's why he's saying that. Because in those cases, it's indicated in the Bhagavatam that merging was impermanent. In other words, it was perceived by some for a particular purpose that this entity that was in the body of a snake, in the case of Agasura, left the body of the snake and entered the body of Bhagavan, but it didn't remain there, it just entered there for a brief period of time. So for that reason, he's saying there isn't really an example of Sayuja given in the Bhagavatam. Asya Bhagavat Lakshananandani Magnata Spurtir Eva Pradhanam Kocharichaya Tadanugrahena Tadiya Tat Shakti Lesh Prapyaiva Yatha Yuktam Bahis Tad Datta Aprakrita Tad Bhoguchishta Lesham Eva Anubhavati Iti Eke. Now this is interesting. He says, it, meaning Sayuja's principal feature, is a manifestation of a state of absorption in Bhagavan's characteristic of bliss. That is, in the bliss that is inherent in Bhagavan's essential nature. Sometimes, only by receiving a trace of that potency of his, that is, of Bhagavan's potency that enables his experience of supermundane objects of enjoyment, by his favor, according to his wish, one who has attained Sayuja experiences externally a traced remnant given by him of his supermundane enjoyment as befitting, that is, in proportion to the amount of his potency for enjoyment that he bestowed upon the recipient. So, what this implies in technical language is that a jiva can experience what it's like to be Bhagavan. Somewhat. In other words, he's saying when he so wishes, by his favor, to the extent that he allows, he can also give some jiva the experience of what it's like for himself to experience his own nature or to have the other experiences that he has. So in Sayuja Mukti, rather than experiencing the worship of Bhagavān or experiencing bhakti to Bhagavān, one can actually experience what it's like to be Bhagavān, somewhat. Right? He says, Uchishta leish eva, that like just a trace of the remnant of what he enjoys, he's experiencing an infinity of wonderful rasas at all times, so to speak, and some meager amount can still rock the world, so to speak, of an infinitesimal conscious entity, an infinitesimal jiva. So some little trace of his infinite experience he may also bestow on such a person. Tatracha natu tam eva sarvam evacha anubhavati iti abhyupagamyam. Therein, that is in the midst of that experience, however, one does not experience that itself, that is the exact experience that Bhagavān does, or all of that. So he's saying, in that experience, it's not that one has the exact experience that Bhagavān has, or the whole experience that Bhagavān has. Some subpart, some limited amount, like like in modern, sometimes in certain websites or certain apps, you can enter a certain depth of the service provided if you have a free account, and then if you pay, you can experience the whole feature set. Something like that. No jiva gets the whole experience of the entire account, but some little limited exposure to certain parts of it. Sarvata tat prapter unabhyupagamatvat, such as to be admitted because of a recipient of Sayuja Mukti's attainment of him in all respects not being admitted. That is, since a recipient of Sayuja Mukti has not attained Bhagavān in full, or become Bhagavān entirely, such a Mukta's experience cannot be equated with that of Bhagavān himself. So Jiva Goswami is saying this, he's giving this as the basis for his reasoning. Or why is he saying this? He's not quoting anything to establish this. He's establishing this by inference and saying no jiva can actually become Bhagavān in full and outright. So because of that, whatever experience that they would have when they merge into him could only be minimal, or could only be partial. It couldn't be complete, or it couldn't be entirely equivalent. So in that way, he's articulating the implications. Tatraisham salukyadinam anavichinna bhagavat prapti rupataya tat sakshatkar visheshatvena brahma kaivalyad adikyam prachin vachanai sutaram eva siddham. In this regard, because of salokya and so forth, being unlike Sayuja special types of direct perception of Bhagavān, on account of there being forms of uninterrupted attainment of him, their superiority to Brahma Kaivalya, meaning Brahma Sayuja Mukti, is definitively established. So there's a higher order of excellence or manifestation of bliss in the differentiated manifestation of Brahman known as Bhagavān than there is in the non-differentiated manifestation known as Nirvishesh or Nirbhed Brahman. So in these four types of moksha other than Sayuja, there's an experience of perceiving that supreme savishesh manifestation of Brahman. So that is of a higher order of excellence or a higher depth of bliss than experiencing the undifferentiated or unqualified manifestation of Brahman, or what is had in Brahma Sayuja Mukti. So in this way, he's ultimately trying to just show that the depth of experience in either category of Sayuja Mukti is lesser than that of these four categories of Mukti, which is on line with other statements made in the Sandarbhas and that is made in the Sindhu, where essentially this entire ontological making of a hierarchy, is that a word, hierarchization, is based on the criterion of ananda, or bliss. And these things are, so to speak, ranked or stacked or graded in that respect. So although they may be equal, as Rupa Goswami writes, Narayan, Shrish, and Krishna are one in terms of siddhānta or ontologically, but when it comes to rasa, there's a difference between them. In other words, the experience of rasa is greater in perception of Krishna than it is in perception of Narayan. But otherwise, the two are equal or equivalent. So something like that, experience of Savishesh Brahman, experience of Nirvishesh Brahman, it's all experience of Brahman. So what makes it different is the depth of ananda that's experienced, and so analyzed in that way, there is said to be an emphasis on these other forms of mukti over and above sayuja, or they're said to be non-antithetical to bhakti and superior in quality to sayuja mukti. So I just bring that up to say that this is like a running thread through the whole Goswami theological framework, that ananda is a criterion for organizing, if you will, so many of the different statements made throughout the Puranas and the Upanishads, and honing in on how one can arrive at discernment of the ultimate Purushartha. So, Sri Jiva also cites the verse under discussion in his Bhakti Sandarbha and Krama Sandarbha-tika on Bhagavat 11.20.34 in regard to ahangrahopasana, that is, taking oneself as the object of worship in one's approach to the Paratattva. So this is also something that typically Bhaktas don't favor, that one can engage in upasana of Bhagavān and do so by worshipping a deity or worshipping a mantra or a name or some particular form or manifestation of Bhagavān. So someone may also say, okay, I'm going to worship Bhagavān and I'm going to make myself the representative object. I'm going to offer worship to myself and in that way worship Bhagavān. So in a simple sense, that's what you call ahamgrahopasana. So he explains that although ahamgrahopasana is accepted as a form of intentness upon the Paratattva that can result in the attainment of Mukti. Okay, so Jiva Goswami does categorically recognize that that is a means to attain Mukti. He might not like it, but he doesn't rule it out as something that's impossible or ineffective. And it's mentioned in the Shastra, it's mentioned in the Vishnu Puran that even Prahlad Maharaj in certain kalpas engaged in such practice. So it can result in the attainment of Mukti. Ahangrahopasana is nonetheless disparaged because it is mocked by pure bhaktas like the Yadus in the case of Pundraka Vasudeva. And because its result is determined to be fit to be rejected in statements such as this of Sri Bhagavān in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, Salokya sarshti samipya sarupyaikatam apyuta diyamanam grinanti vinamat sivanam janaha. Without my service, people, meaning one-pointed bhaktas, do not accept even salokya, sarshti, samipya, sarupya, or ekatva, even when these are offered by me. So, who then would engage in ahangropasana? More so persons following the path of Gyan, who may be integrating a mild form of bhakti, and moreover bhakti in the style of ahangropasana. So he's saying that while it's categorically recognized as a viable means to the pursuit of mukti, it's not something that bhaktas favor. Because why focus on yourself as the object of worship when you could just focus on Bhagavān? When you could just directly adore his deity form or his name or some other most adorable manifestation of his. And when one is so keen upon rendering service to him, then there's no direct inclination for that. Sri Jiva then states, quote, "This is stated by Sri Hanuman," and cites the second half of the verse under discussion. So now this is where it's a little bit problematic, is here in the Padyavali, this verse is attributed to an author named Shiva Moli, but Jiva Gosvami in the Sandarbhas attributes it to Hanuman. So it appears like what Rupa Goswami wrote is different than what Jiva Gosvami has said. Although the critical edition of Padyavali lists 4 variant spellings of the name of the author of the verse under discussion, none of them include Hanuman. Given that the next verse here in Padyavali is marked as being spoken by Hanuman, it is possible that Sri Jiva consulted an edition of Padyavali as he wrote Bhakti Sandarbha, and in the edition he consulted, the verse under discussion was attributed to Hanuman along with the following verse. Or perhaps he got it from another source where it attributed both to Hanuman. Who knows? It's hard to say why exactly there appears to be different attribution of the author between Sri Rupa and Sri Jiva. Not a critical point, but nevertheless I'm just giving some discussion of it in case anyone else ever wonders what's going on. Whatever the case may be, the point to be gleaned from Sri Jiva's citation of the verse is that he cites it as an instance of condemnation of desiring moksha in lieu of bhakti. He then says, quote, "Thus intending all of this," that is the aforesaid conclusions, Bhagavān designates unconditional or niskinchana bhakti specifically as above all, by way of praising such bhaktas, that is, bhaktas endowed with such unconditional bhakti, as in 11.20.34. Quod na kinchit sarvo dhira bhakta hye kantino mama, vachantapi maya dattam kaivalyam apunar bhavam. My virtuous, wise, and one-pointed bhaktas do not desire anything, not even ultimate non-repetition of birth, that is mukti, when offered to them by me. So it's one thing to not want it, but if someone gives it to you anyway, okay. Or it's one thing if someone gives it to you, you don't really want it, but when a very important person comes, then, okay. Or it's one thing when Bhagavān himself comes and says, won't you take it? Still when you say no, then you know you really don't want it. So he's saying, my bhaktas don't want it even when I offer it to them. So really they don't want it. Sri Jiva then cites a portion of Sri Samipad's commentary on this verse, which Sri Sanatana elaborates on as follows. So he writes, wise means possessed of understanding. Since they are one-pointed upon me, meaning they are endowed with priti solely for me, or, alternately, endowed with singular fixity upon me by virtue of bhakti to me, they do not accept moksha even when offered by me. What more is to be said? They do not even desire it. This is the meaning. Alternately, the meaning is as follows, They do not even desire anything. So what more is to be said? They do not accept even ultimate non-repetition of birth. So purity is equated with desirelessness, and desirelessness of even moksha is the pinnacle of desirelessness, or nishkinchanata, or nishkamata. So this is one way of showing the extreme of the one-pointedness upon bhakti that these Uttama Bhaktas have. Given that Sri Bhagavān himself considers a bhakta who does not desire mukti to be virtuous and wise, and the statement in the verse under discussion, quote, "What fool, having attained that servitude to Bhagavān, desires the position of mastership," can be understood to indicate that it is only one who lacks understanding of what is beneficial and non-beneficial for oneself that desires mastership, or prābhavaṁ. And, quote, mastership, as was stated earlier, can be understood to refer to sayuja mukti, or, more broadly, to any of the 5 types of mukti, since in all of them one attains some degree of experience of Sri Bhagavān's divine power, or aishvarya, form, plane, and presence. Alternately, it can also be understood to refer to aham-grahopasana. So this prābhavaṁ, you could take it as aham-grahopasana, you could take it as sayuja mukti, you could take it as any type of mukti. In all cases, the bhakta is one-pointed upon sevā to Bhagavān, and therefore is not interested in anything otherwise. Finally, that servitude to Bhagavān is spoken of in the verse under discussion as, quote, having been attained, can be understood in 2 ways. To refer either to a jiva's simply being beginningsly possessed of the essential nature of being a servant of Bhagavān, as was discussed earlier in the commentary on the 5th verse of Srimad Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, cited here in verse 71 of Padyavali, or it can be understood to refer to a jiva's acquisition of knowledge that their own essential nature is that of a servant of Sri Bhagavān, along with the opportunity to learn and follow the path of bhakti by the grace of a mahat, who teaches them about bhakti and grants them diksha into a mantra related to Sri Bhagavān, such that they acquire the status of being formally recognized as a Vaishnava, that is, as a servant of Bhagavān. So when he's saying, what fool, having attained dāsatāṁ, or servitude, would desire mastership, or would desire anything else? So when he says, to quote, attain dāsatāṁ, what does that mean? So one way it means that dāsatāṁ is the nature of the jiva, as we hear in the Padma Puran that Jiva Gosvami cites in the Paramatma Sandarbha, Harer Dasyaiva Harer Dasyaiva, I forget how that line goes. Anyway, that the nature of the jiva is to be a servant of Hari and never anything else, which is paraphrased in the Charitamrita as Jiva Risharupoi Krishner Nitya Das, that the jiva is, the essential nature of the jiva is to be a servant of Krishna. That can be understood in a general sense to be the dasata, or the servanterhood of the jiva. So then to quote, attain that would mean to become aware that that's one's nature, since the jiva under anadya vidya doesn't know that. So to quote, attain that means to become aware of that. And alternately, dasata could mean the quote, like the tva, or the nis, can also be taken in the sense of status. So the status of being a servant of Bhagavān can be understood in the sense of the status of being formally and dedicated to the path of bhakti, which comes about by receiving diksha, receiving a mantra, as per the shastric designations. One who's received diksha into a mantra related to Vishnu is a Vaishnava. One whose Ishta Devata is Vishnu is a Vaishnava, or is a servant of Bhagavān. So, if you've already come to the path of bhakti, you've taken the vow of following the path of bhakti, why would you go and desire moksha? Why would you go and desire ahangrahopasana? Why would you go and pursue something less than what you would achieve by following the path that you're already on? In that way, the foolishness could also be taken to be implied. So, that's what I have on this verse. So, these may be, general categories, so to speak, and for persons who might struggle with very ordinary desires for very common things, it might feel like a lot of tall talk to talk all about not desiring even moksha, because, from a particular perspective, it might seem like, I don't desire moksha, I just desire Krishna. But then, if you're thinking like that, and at the same time you're still desiring so many common little things, and you're still seeking to avoid even minor forms of suffering, then to say that really you're ready for an eternity of being subject to future suffering, which is essentially what being part of samsara is not so easy to say. And, typically it's understood that the desire for enjoyments of the world are let go of before one's readiness to even let go of the desire to be freed from sufferings. In other words, the general drive in the psyche is to experience sukh and avoid dukh. So maybe if you're content with it, it's one thing to be content with a bit less sukh, but it's another thing to just say, okay, the dukh is fine. That's harder to do. So, at the same time, it's not that this is meant to be a type of masochism or, self-mutilation or self-denial or something like that. The psyche is the way that it is. It's built such that it gravitates towards sukh and it avoids dukh. So that's not, you could say, a character flaw in and of itself to have that tendency, but rather to, as we've discussed in previous classes, to pin it or to orient that tendency of the mind around an object other than Bhagavān's satisfaction is the problem. To feel sukh because of Bhagavān's sukh, that's healthy, that's fine. And to feel dukh because of his dukh, that's also appreciable, and wonderfully, that's also a form of sukh, ultimately. That attunement to Bhagavān such that one even feels disturbed by the idea that he would be disturbed, actually wonderfully produces a deeper type of sukh. This is the wonderful nature of things of the spiritual plane, if you will, that even the quote-unquote suffering that emerges from the Sarup Shakti and that emerges from attunement to Bhagavān's satisfaction is not really dukh in the ultimate sense, and it can't be. And one reason Rupa Goswami gives is that when its object, or when it is oriented around a cognition that contains Krishna in the cognition, whatever form it may be, and Krishna is bliss himself, you can't get that. That's built into the cognition, so you can't get it out of there. So it becomes this sort of form of dukh that's made of sukh, so to speak, like as if, like a snowman made of sugar candy or something like that, where it's cold, it's like a snowman, but yet it's sweet like sugar. It's somehow both at the same time. So I bring up this point, which is something we've talked about on a number of previous occasions, just to say that when it talks what we talked about earlier as the person who relishes only the sweetness of prema seva and not anything else, and here the person desires only the service of Bhagavān and not moksha, this doesn't mean that the person is actually trying to negate the psyche's tendency towards sukha. Rather, it's actually just hyper-focusing that tendency on that which is the ultimate form of sukha, namely cognition of Krishna, dedication to Krishna, bhakti to Krishna, attunement to the pleasure of Krishna, alignment with whatever Krishna is feeling. All of this is actually the most profound form of sukha, but yet at the same time is not always easy to feel and not always comfortable, and therefore also poses its challenges for even his companions in the course of eternal Leela. And that is a subject which we will hear many sublime things about later on in the Padyavali as we go into all the discussion of the various rasas and experience of Braj, which comprise the later thirds of this text. So these are just a few general points on the topic, but what I mean to add here at the end is just that this idea of disregard for moksha, this is something that can emerge from purification of the psyche and can emerge from the depth that one can actually feel the deep satisfaction that comes from bhakti itself, from the experience of Bhagavān himself that comes about by having bhakti to him. So this disregard for moksha is something that manifests in tandem with one's depth of absorption in bhakti to Bhagavān. And at the same time, in general, for the aspirant, there will be a philosophical orientation, so to speak, where moksha is understood not to be the goal and isn't desired in the sense that one doesn't cognitively, in a theoretical manner, conceive that to be one's object, which is also an important feature of learning the teachings and following the path, and not to be dismissed either. So we'll hear two or three more verses on this topic. This is a short prakaran, and then we'll come to the next section here in the text. But here I've just overviewed a bit of technicality regarding the subject of moksha, because we don't have that anywhere else in the Padyavali. So here we get the gist of Jiva Goswami's analysis from the Sandarbhas on the subject. So to conclude, I'll just review the original verse. It says, Bhakti is service to Bhagavān, Mukti is disregard for that object. What fool, having attained that service, desires the position of mastership? So this can also be a tool of introspection. Why, O mind, do you again turn away from the name? Do you again turn away from Bhagavān when you've had this chance to adore him? Why turn away from the chance to serve him and pursue, mastership of whatever other form, be it over some particular material object, or be it mastership in the sense of Sayuja Mukti or what have you. So in the state where the psyche is still struggling or suffering, so to speak, with vasanas for other desires, then this type of poetry can also be instrumental in the cool, calming, clear exercise of the faculty of the buddhi, the vivek, the discernment, in the course of one's ongoing practice. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback, they're welcome to share. All right, well, we can leave it at that for the evening, and next time we'll go further. We'll hear a famous verse of Hanuman, which was referred to here by Jiva Goswami in the commentary, which is also cited in the Sindhu, and which richly encapsulates the spirit of bhakti over and above, or appreciation for bhakti over and above moksha. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam. Thank you. Thank you.